discussion this morning on a topic that we know many our members and others are deeply interested in right now. Before we get started, we have some folks on the line who are not members of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, so I just want to make sure you understand who we are. ARM is an international advocacy organization dedicated to bringing the promise of safe and effective regenerative medicines to patients around the world. For us, regenerative medicine means cell and gene therapy and tissue engineering. Our organization has more than 350 members, a diverse group of members, mostly companies, but also research institutions and patient advocacy groups spread across 25 countries. Our work primarily focuses on trying to achieve clear and predictable harmonized regulatory pathways for regenerative medicines, effective reimbursement policies so that they can be successfully commercialized and brought to patients. We address the manufacturing and industrialization hurdles of cell and gene therapy, and we compile sector data to help various stakeholders understand the size, scope, and particulars of this sector. Like many of you, we've sort of had to pivot a bit to adjust to life in the pandemic era. This cell and gene therapy webinar series is one aspect of that. We have also established a COVID-19 resource library that is specific to cell and gene and the issues that practitioners in the cell and gene space have. We've launched a CEO discussion forum limited to the top executives of our member companies, so they have a place to go and talk about the particular challenges facing companies and organizations right now. And then for those of you who may not be familiar, we do a weekly newsletter of all of the developments in this space, and we've added, of course, a special section about COVID-19 to that. These and other resources about the regenerative medicine sector can be found at our website at www.alliancerm.org. The next webinar in this series will be held on May 21st and will feature folks from Athersys and Pluristem. We'll talk about cell therapy treatments for COVID-19, which have been, of course, much in the news of late. Moving on to our conversation for today. So I'm joined by John Myslowski, who's the CEO of Castle Creek Biosciences, as well as the chair of the Capital Formation Committee at ARM, longtime active member of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and somebody who, interestingly, has managed to raise $75 million in the midst of the pandemic, so has some personal experience to bring to the conversation today. Bola Amusa is a partner at Chardin and also the director of research and head of healthcare research there. Chardin, for those of you not familiar with it, is a global investment bank specializing in healthcare. They have been deeply involved in this cell and gene therapy space for some time, most recently as the lead manager, for example, of the Passage Bio IPO in February. And then last but not least, Jason Pitts is the principal of private equity at Sofinnova Investments. Sofinnova is a late preclinical and clinical stage biopharma investment firm with more than $2.3 billion in assets, decades worth of experience. It's a firm that invests both in private and public equity, including in our space, Audentes, Spark, Histogenics. So I think we've got a great group of folks today to help shed some light on the current environment and answer your questions. Here's the way ahead. We were finished here with welcome and introductions. I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to moderate a conversation with Jason and Bola for about half an hour. And then I will start drawing questions from the Q&A for all three of our panelists. Please don't use the chat function. We won't be looking for questions in the chat function. We'll just be looking for questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. This webinar will be recorded and made available shortly on the ARM website too. So with that, give me a sec. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to go dark and I'm going to turn it over to John.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Janet. I appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody and have this very important discussion. Thank you, Jason and Bola, also for joining the conversation. I think we'll have some interesting topics to go over and looking forward to your questions as well. You know, I think everybody on the call is probably in the same boat of really navigating this COVID epidemic. And, you know, as we're thinking through things like clinical trial milestones, and we're thinking about manufacturing supply and raw material supply, and even supplying PPE for our clean rooms, there's always the lingering question behind about ongoing funding and burn rate. And so, you know, I think an important question to ask around, you know, what's the climate going to be like? What are some of our predictions? What are some of the feedback? And so that will be the center of our discussion today. Let's talk a little bit about what Jason and Bola have seen in the investment sort of temperature, and what are some of the thoughts and opinions and expectations from there. So what I think we'll do is we'll jump right in and sort of start with the general impression, Jason and Bola. You know, just what is your current assessment of the landscape right now for fundraising, and actually, you know, private and public? You know, there's membership from both avenues on the call, and I think it'd be interesting to hear your opinions on both sides.
Sure. I can start with a quick discussion of how we are thinking about private fundraising for companies right now. So I think it kind of divides into companies that are already in our portfolio versus kind of new investments that we're looking to make. So for companies already in our portfolio, what we're looking to do is ensure they have at least 12 months of runway. We usually do prefer larger fundraising rounds anyway, so a lot of our companies were already well positioned there. But for the companies that did need some extra funding, there's a few avenues that we're seeking: either leverage the already existing syndicate to do some kind of extension to give them some extra runway to a value creating catalysts. Consider bringing in one or two investors in an extension, or potentially access debt facilities. We're trying to hold off on, you know, large financings right now for our portfolio companies in general, but that's not a 100% rule. But just because the unpredictable nature of the environment right now and the terms under which a new financing might happen, when we're looking for new financings, I think we're a little bit more valuation sensitive than we were 6 months ago, certainly. We're looking to raise rounds that will give the companies probably about 2 years of runway to give them a significant window on the other side of the current events, and really focusing on syndicates that we're confident will be able to continue to fund the company through multiple rounds of financing, such that if we do need to get creative with any kind of capital needs for the company, we think we have a syndicate there that's not already tapped out and won't be kind of towards the end of their fund. And I would say that in general, what we're trying to do is ensure companies are on the other side of this thing, and we're looking a little bit more also to the European markets, where valuations tend to be, I guess, a little bit more like rational than the U.S. market, and that's something we're more actively pursuing. But we're definitely looking to still deploy capital. We're just the filter is tightened a little bit in the current environment.
Right, right. And Bola, on the public company front, have you seen, what are some of the trends you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, we can actually comment on private as well.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, we're exposed in both markets. It's actually overall reasonably good given the macro that's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the private market actually doing a bit better. But, you know, I think there was like a 2-week pause to assess the new normal. But in the private market, I think that's actually been strong this year after a good amount of fundraising by VCs last year and actually pretty good deployment of capital. But I think something like 2.6 billion has been done in financings in the private market this year, while the public's done something like 1.8 billion. And in the private, valuations are maybe down over the last 6 weeks, but the average deal size has been, I think, stayed stable at around 55 million. And we're seeing a pretty good group of cell and gene therapy companies doing some pretty good financings. There was Recode with the Series A, Affinia, Dynacure, Swan Bio, Taysha, Legend Bio. Those were all Series A's, mostly, except for, I think, Dynacure was a Series C. So there's a pretty good amount of deal flow in the private markets, but my suspicion is the valuations will come down a bit. But like I said, the average deal size has been pretty good. On the public side, I think 4 of 11 IPOs have been done after the market dislocation caused by COVID-19, so it's still functioning. And it seems to be driven by continued support from insiders. So they're saying, look, these are our companies. We're going to support them going forward. The deal sizes there have also come down a little bit. But I think what that's done is it's helped the IPOs price within their range. And then they've had pretty good aftermarket performance. And so people are actually now looking to support more transactions, given that people aren't getting burned, let's say. In the cell and gene therapy land, there hasn't been as much activity post-COVID-19, but I think it's just more of a timing issue. But we did have high-profile ones earlier in the year, like Passage and Beam. In the follow-on market, when you're looking at deals over 25 million, you're actually seeing deals that are driven by catalysts. So to the extent of companies saying, hey, we just produced on something good, we are seeing people put in capital. But again, I think discounts are going up a little bit, but as long as we're seeing decent returns, that market continues to be open for now. It's going to be telling, activity is often high in June and July with a pause in August. So we're about to enter, a pretty important point to figure out whether these capital markets are in fact functioning pretty well.
That's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah. And see how the year continues with the trend. So will companies who are at different stages of development, so, be it late phase, be it early phase, are you finding that they're being sort of affected differently by COVID based on their development? Is there sort of later phase companies have more of an appeal because they're more de-risked? Or is there an appetite now for preclinical or early research stage because of the lesser capital commitment up front? Do either of you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to draw, I think, broad conclusions that could apply kind of in general to all companies at stage, or all companies in a given therapeutic area. Because what our focus tends to be companies that are in an IND enabling stage, or companies that are in usually phase 1, phase 2. We'll occasionally make some phase 3 investments as well. I think what we're keying in on now is we are being more rigorous and looking at how COVID could potentially impact that company specifically. Are they reliant on a study that's ongoing that's accessing a lot of academic centers in areas that are particularly affected by COVID? Is it a situation where they need to come in for multiple administrations of therapeutic in a hospital setting? I think all of those things raise the risk of potential delays. Now, that doesn't make those companies completely unappealing, but it makes it so that we need to work with the companies to ensure that they have a financing put together and a plan put together that will ensure that with the current round that they're raising, they can still hit the value inflection points that they're looking to seek. So in the end, we're still actively looking at all stages. I think we are a little bit more partial to companies that are in kind of IND enabling studies, maybe a year out from clinic, and companies that have just finished a clinical trial and are working with regulators to kind of get into the next one versus companies that have just started a clinical trial and may experience some delays or some issues with data collection. But we're not blanket dismissing those companies. We're just making sure that we work with them to really understand what their study is going to look like in the next 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, before, let's say, COVID-19 became something that affected everybody pretty much, a lot of the fast moving, in the sense that they act ahead of the market, investors, these are long-term investors, I don't mean they trade often, they actually started to focus on preclinical companies, the ones that we talked to, because they understood that the disruptions from COVID-19 will often be enrollment of clinical trials. Patients can't get to sites as easily, and they may choose to stay home. So preclinical science and moving it forward, sometimes, and this is kind of a joke, but sometimes there's social distancing in scientific work in labs. So they're still able to get in there and do their work. And VC investors tend to be longer term. So if there's a 3 to 5 year horizon, let's say, the COVID-19 pandemic hopefully wouldn't affect the investment. And if they are getting things at a little bit of a discount, that actually makes them all the more happy, since they have this capital to deploy. I do have a proxy for, how at least the market's treating it. And these are just performance data that I pulled this morning. But since since year to date, the S&P 500 is down 11%, NASDAQ is flat, drugs, which is mostly big pharma, is down 3%. So there's a little bit of a flight to healthcare drug stocks for defensive purposes. Biotechs up 6%, and genetic medicines, which is in vivo gene therapy, ex vivo gene therapy, gene editing, and RNA names, we exclude cell-based IO. That space is up 48%. So, in a way, later stage companies have underperformed the earlier stage companies, because big pharma tends to be driven. And I have other data in terms of performance, different points on COVID-19.
Yeah, it's striking, for the genetic space. For back to sort of the investors themselves, and thinking about how some of our community companies are positioning on milestones. Clearly, clinical trials are being impacted, and it's at centers who are focusing on COVID treatments, and we could be dealing with high risk populations that just simply can't participate. It's a time where I think companies are being very delicate. They have to be careful about their milestones slipping, and obviously, as that is important and impactful to investors. What are some of the sort of reactions we're seeing from investors? How is their temperature right now with seeing milestones putting out? I think, Jason, you touched a little bit on ensuring, sort of capitalization of companies you work with out for a year plus. But what has sort of been the reaction?
I think you have to be realistic that most investors are going to be very conscious of this and are likely going to, in light of any potential delays, be more valuation conscious when you're thinking about going out and raising capital. The cost of capital is up a little bit right now, at least in companies that we're looking at, due to the uncertainty that we anticipate over the next several months. I think if anybody could look in a crystal ball and say in 6 months you're not going to see any issues from COVID and you won't see any delays, then
right.
It would be a lot easier. But I think with the current uncertainty, what we're doing is we're still looking at cell and gene therapy companies. Certainly, we've even recently, made some additional investments in some of our portfolio companies like Akuos. So we're still actively pursuing capital, and like I said, the important thing is to work with the companies to understand the exact nature of the delays. I think if a company comes to us and they just give us a very high level spiel about, oh, there might be some delays due to COVID, that's a red flag for us. But if we see a well thought through contingency plan for exactly how they're going to handle delays, how they're going to handle data collection, how they could handle site startup delays, these are things that we're willing to work with companies on and try to chart a course. And it may be that we give them feedback that they need to prioritize the lead program right now and kind of maybe slow some of the backup programs such that they have enough capital to be able to pivot if they do run into some issues and some choppy waters with the running of the current trial. But we work with them on that.
Yeah, from my perspective, the delays so far in the cell and gene therapy space have not been as meaningful as they could have been. A lot of the companies that we follow, certainly if they're going after life-threatening diseases, especially late-line oncology or late-line cancers, we're actually seeing pretty modest delays for the companies that have to enroll and actually produce results. But I want to comment on, the importance of management here. So much of the stock's valuation is dependent on management and their ability to execute. So really what investors want to see is that management's getting out in front of this and actually managing as best as possible. Clearly, no one foresaw this, and it's no one's fault directly for any delays that are sort of unavoidable. But you just want to make sure the contingencies are in place and they can move the story forward. What I do think is underappreciated is the ability for one-time treatments to actually mitigate some of these issues in the future. And that's what gene therapy is all about. You treat a patient once and they're done. So gene therapy trials are actually, on average, seeing relatively few disruptions because if a patient's treated, they don't need to get treated again. And if there is a little bit of loss on follow-up, you can get meaningful data at a later point as well. And let's not forget, I think 3, 4, 5 years from now, gene therapies, if people don't have to go into the hospital for IV treatments and things like that, that will also reduce the impact in some instances of another pandemic. So far so good is what I would say. Investors are understanding, but you do have to worry about in a few instances of whether companies are lumping delays for other reasons into COVID-19 and using that as an excuse.
Yeah, it's interesting. Talking a little bit on the positivity side of this, where maybe there's been good traction in cell and gene therapy through clinical trials, and we've also seen a number of other positive signals, be it deals and IPOs and Series A's, but also I thought was striking. We're seeing funding for new life science funds. Examples being recently Venn securing $394 million, Arch 1.5 billion. Recently, is this a positive trend? Is it a timing based sort of event, or is it somewhat a signal that there's still interest in advanced biotech therapies, including our cell and gene products? And do we see this continue through the year? Are these pools of funding going to continue to be available?
I think there's probably a few prongs to that. So with any VC fundraising, a lot of the VCs that are kind of closing new funds during the current period likely began raising those funds many months prior, and many of those funds are on their 4th, 5th, or 6th fund, where they have a locked-in set of LPs that are confident in them. So there's one aspect of it that is a lot of these processes were in motion before, and a lot of those relationships had been developed extensively through time. However, I think it is a good sign that you're still seeing the close happen in the current environment, and I think that's part of what Bola was alluding to, that healthcare and biotech is partially a defensive position right now. If you look at how the market was impacted as a whole by COVID, especially in March, although everything was down a little bit, you see XBI, NBI down less than S&P 500. The rebound there has been sharper, and there's some appeal to venture investing, as you mentioned, where you're looking at something like a 3 to 5 or even 6 year horizon for a given company. I think the anticipation is that that kind of timeline will allow you to generate value and not have to worry about any kind of choppiness or volatility that might exist, day to day on COVID news flow. And so there's, I think, general support for the industry, and there's good reason to believe that the industry can still perform. I know for our fund particularly, we had funds invested through the 2008 financial crisis, and that was one of our best performing funds. And I think you can see that with a lot of biotech VCs, that biotech is actually fairly well positioned to weather these kind of events, because you're not relying on day-to-day consumer spending. You're relying on meaningful clinical catalysts at the end of the day to really generate value, and that's still going to be there in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to that list as well that you mentioned, John. Longitude Capital, I think, also had a pretty good raise at the end of last year. So, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of capital out there, and I think people are looking to put it to work. So there probably will be less fundraising activity this year, that's my guess. But we're also going to see an active private market because there's dry powder. Sorry for the analogy, but yeah, people want to put money to work, and healthcare is defensive. People aren't going to stop taking their insulin if there's a pandemic, at least if things don't get much worse than they already are. So I think people are going to look to invest. Good activity this year, but less fundraising.
Absolutely. So, Jason, I specifically thinking about how VCs are thinking now. I think you touched very nicely on sort of your procedure of how you're managing your companies. Are you seeing that throughout other VCs? There was a recent article that talked about, what steps should companies be taking now? What are they doing sort of in this situation, looking at their cash on hand, thinking about burn rate, looking at their clinical trial time points going out, looking at the health of their company, reanalyzing their runway, being cautious, putting pressure on valuations, like worrying about their future. These are common, I think, themes from management teams. Is this sound right to you? Are these the feedback you're getting, and how are the VCs managing that?
I would say overall, this is the feedback we're getting, and we're definitely prioritizing making sure our companies are well capitalized. And I think that obviously there's two ways you can do that, right? You can look to extend the runway with the current funds that they have, which is prioritizing the programs that you think are going to generate near-term catalysts, making sure they stay on track, maybe pausing some of the earlier stage programs that are a little bit further out, so that you can ensure that you have a little bit extra runway and a little bit extra contingency capital for your lead. The other thing that we're looking to do is, we're still looking to put money to work outside our current portfolio. I think a lot of other people are as well. And what we're trying to do is actively work with other VCs to understand the needs of their current portfolio. And I think at the end of the day, no one's looking to just give away equity in companies where they have a significant stake. They're looking to raise capital and make sure that they're protecting their companies, but they're not looking to raise them on extremely onerous terms. And I don't think most investors are necessarily looking to do that. I think in the end, people are a little bit more valuation conscious now, but it's not. I don't think it's to the extent where people are trying to, force people to take down rounds and things like that. It's more of a focus on, hey, can we come in as an extension? Can we find a way to work with you creatively so that we can invest in the company, give the extra capital that you need, but also come in under terms that account for the uncertainty that we're seeing right now.
So, what do you think, Jason? Are VCs? Do you think you'll see them putting more money in to companies to support them through COVID delays, basically funding? What would the dynamic be with previous investors? Would it be the same syndicate? Is it something new? Is there a bigger fund coming in, creating new terms? Could this cause any chaos in a cap structure on a company?
I think it depends on how the current investor base is currently structured. If your current investor base are close to the end of their funds, or have already invested in multiple funds and multiple rounds, and the company might be a little tapped out, then you're probably looking at bringing in one or more investors in some kind of extension round, or even potentially considering a full financing. I don't think, I would never advise a company that has real capital needs right now to completely avoid the markets, because deals are getting done. If you have an appealing profile, you can raise money right now. That being said, it is a little chaotic, I would say, right now, and we're being a little bit more creative in structure for our portfolio companies than we previously may have been. Definitely revising valuation expectations. Like, let's say we were expecting a 30 or 40% step up, maybe we're doing a 10% step up or a flat round, because the most important thing is to make sure that the company is funded through the catalysts.
Right.
And not just optimizing around a step up for your next financing.
Right.
And I think, I can't speak for every investor in that, but I think most investors that are carefully stewarding their companies have that view that the most important thing is getting to that key catalyst, and not just optimizing around a step up each round.
Right. Right. And Bola, for you, like for a public company and, not in the COVID space, and they need to do a follow-on by the end of the year, what do you think those companies should be doing today to think about that? How should they be preparing for something that could have a different atmosphere towards the end of the year, but, obviously necessary for continued operations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a simple framework for the stock market is that it's all about supply and demand. So enhance the demand so that there's more shares that can be taken into the market. And I think management is particularly important. You got to hustle to oversimplify things, hustle in a good way, in a transparent and frank way. Get out there, speak to investors to communicate hidden value. That's the key thing. I ask companies, what's the hidden value in your story? What's the market missing? And every now and then they say, oh, the market gets our story. And I was like, no, if there's nothing the market's missing, no one wants to own more shares. So you have to understand how investors think. What are they missing? And then in terms of enhancing demand, you also want to articulate inflection points, because if people get in, they want to feel like they can get out. If liquidity, for example, isn't high enough, so catalysts create liquidity. Ideally, you want to articulate the 1 year, the 3 year, the 5 year for all types of investors so that there's higher demand for the shares. And then I often see companies miss the European opportunity if they're in the US. And that's particularly important. There was one fund that participated in an offering that we did, and some biotechs had never heard of it. And I was like, that fund has over $1 trillion under management, probably like 10 trillion. So Europe has a ton of capital, and there are, you have to be selective to find the right investors, but they're ready, willing, and able to invest in biotech. But understand how the Europeans work. They need a little more time to do their work and diligence, so you got to meet with them early. But as a general rule, meet with everyone early, because no one, I shouldn't say no one, very few will invest on a single meeting. They need to get to know a story over time. So, be transparent, be honest, don't make things up. If it's science, it's got to be tested. But, I think ultimately that strategy will work. And then I think the last thing I'd say is just understand the comps and valuation as well, because sometimes you're beholden to market effects like that.
And I think that's also interesting in the IPO market as well. What do you think about the pandemic impact on IPOs? There was already an election this year, may have made some decision making on IPOs already. Has this affected it further? We've seen some mobility there.
Yeah, I mean, I think entering the year, everyone was worried about the elections and maybe offerings by September, because who knows what's going to happen afterwards. Now it's the pandemic that's become the primary driver of what people are thinking, and then the elections are secondary. But like I said earlier, June and July are particularly active months, so it'll be telling to see what's done in those months. I actually think that we'll extend activity into August, just given that the economy might be emerging, who knows, but it might be emerging from some of the shutdown worries. So yeah, I mean, I think companies, if they're running out of cash, they need to raise money. They will try to go public if they can, but this might shift some of those opportunities to crossover rounds or Series C's, et
Right.
cetera. So yeah.
Right.
Yeah, from our perspective, we're trying to ensure that any of our portfolio companies are not dependent on access to public capital in the short term. I would say maybe a year or two ago, we were definitely under the assumption that given certain data readouts, access to the public markets would certainly be there. And we're still acting as if there are potential windows. We're definitely not preparing as if the public markets are shut, because by all accounts right now, they are not. But we are building in a contingency plan such that we feel that we can fund fully through additional clinical catalysts without needing to access the public markets. And that's the kind of contingency planning that we're looking to build in right now. We think the IPOs will still happen, but what you'll probably see is stronger profiles, more meaningful data catalysts. Just the profile of companies is likely to change in the next couple of months, and I think the summer will be very informative on how that plays out.
Right.
Hey, John.
Sure. Sure, Janet. Yeah, we'll come over to you now. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, no worries. We've got some questions on the line. One of them is, actually, we've got a couple questions that kind of relate to large pharma M&A activity, and given kind of disruptions in other kinds of financing, or even just in spite of it, what's your expectation about what kind of large pharma M&A activity we might see in the remainder of 2020?
I think there's one view that M&A activity is a little bit countercyclical to public markets and private markets activity. That the more frothy the funding environment gets, the higher valuations get, the harder it gets to execute on M&A. You've seen some large M&A earlier this year, and our anticipation is that M&A will continue, especially for companies like cell and gene therapies, where you're treating life-threatening diseases oftentimes, and the demand is going to be there for those diseases. So we think that companies are still going to have quite a bit of appetite in the current environment.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. Counter-cyclical, but also with a bit of delay. So large pharma has tremendous advantages on distribution, but it tends to move a little more slowly than, let's say, fast-paced biotech. So, I mean, we've seen pandemics before, not to this extent, obviously, but there was, bird flu, swine flu, et cetera. And post those, with a little bit of a delay, we saw a tremendous amount of acquisitions of vaccines companies, names like MedImmune, Chiron, even smaller names like Crucell. Glaxo actually got ID Biomedical, if I remember the name correctly, for that Canadian company. And then years later, in 2009-10, they probably had £1 billion of sales from flu pandemic. So, these companies, the big cap pharma names, know that the pandemic can be quite lucrative. I think Roche did $3 or $4 billion on Tamiflu during the 2009-10 pandemic. Hopefully my numbers are still right. It's been a while. But the point is that we are seeing partnerships already, like Pfizer, BioNTech. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And I think the market's bid up some of those names because they know that it's reasonably realistic that there could be acquisitions down the line. I think acquisitions would be more likely if the market crashes because, and I don't think that, well, I shouldn't take a view on that, but if it were to happen, we have to remember big pharma's cash piles aren't going to be much changed, and they become weapons for big pharma. The one thing that works against a lot of cell and gene therapy companies is that their programs are early and their platforms. And big pharma knows that if you acquire a platform whose value are the people, those people will often leave to start new biotechs with all the experience they just had and the resume of being bought. I think Allogene and other examples like that speak to that story. So the ideal acquisitions are often companies like Avexis, where it's more about a product that big pharma can better globalize than a small biotech. And in Avexis's case, there wasn't as much of a platform as there was a product. So you're going to see the later stage companies, things that are post proof of concept, entering pivotals or post pivotals, those will continue to get acquired with, I think, high frequency.
So thanks. Another one of the questions on the line has to do with just the deal flow in general. How has the inbound deal flow changed, if at all, during COVID?
So for us, there was, I think it happened in a couple of phases. There was an initial shock where I think everybody kind of took a step back and was trying to figure out the world. So for a few weeks in March, deal flow really slowed down for us. And obviously that was due to a few factors. One, everybody figuring out how to kind of switch over to virtual operations instead of having teams fly out to the coasts and visit every VC firm. And I think the other part of it was just it's hard to raise money when the market looks like it's in free fall. And I think people didn't want to engage in those conversations at that point because it was hard to have a constructive conversation because, you know, when things are looking as scary as they did for a few weeks in March, it can be difficult to have, I think, what companies would view as a sensible conversation around valuation and other aspects of the raise. Now that I think things, at least in the markets, have stabilized a little bit, and both the companies and the investors are more accustomed to just doing business completely virtually, just having Zoom meetings, not having face-to-face, not doing site visits. Deal flow has picked up for us and has accelerated, and I would say we're maybe a little bit off from where we were a year ago, but much closer than I would have anticipated a month ago. So I would say we're probably still seeing about 70 to 80% of the deal flow we were seeing pre-pandemic, and we're still looking to invest at a reasonably similar pace to what we were looking to invest before.
Yeah, I mean, I cited some metrics on deal flow. I guess it depends on how you define it, whether it's offerings or corporate partnerships. We don't have a lot of data on corporate partnerships, but my understanding is that it's down a little bit. But like I said, in the genetic medicine space, you're seeing some interesting ones, such as Pfizer and Biotech. So we'll see how it goes from here.
Again, I'll combine a couple of questions. We have one questioner who received public money, is in the COVID space, and received some public money to support that development, is now looking for private co-funding for that venture. So I wonder if you have any thoughts in particular about the COVID space versus the non-COVID space, maybe is the first question. And then any particular dynamics that you're seeing around investments in the COVID space, such as the availability of public funds in addition to private funds.
I mean, availability of public funds is always helpful for a company, and we certainly don't shy away from potential investments in the COVID space. But I think it needs to be said that any investor, and certainly us, are not just looking to have blanket excitement about potential investments into COVID. We're definitely still taking a very measured approach and evaluating it on a product by product basis within the company. Because there's a lot of ways that you could just repurpose something and say, oh, now we have a COVID asset in the pipeline. And those opportunities are not that interesting to us. But if you feel that you have a legitimate advantage, whether that be in the therapy you have in hand, you think it could have a defined efficacy advantage, or you think you have a platform that could produce an effective therapeutic, not just for COVID, but for other potential infectious diseases that may arise, and that could be valuable as well, then that's something that we would look at. But just kind of opportunistic Me Too opportunities don't generate that much interest on our end, just to be honest about that.
Yeah, I don't really have much of a view on where to get private funding. I would just say that I think I saw some metric weeks ago, and these numbers have probably gone up, but there's something like 100 COVID-19 related products in clinical trials now. So at some point, you know, there are going to be some big winners that come out of all of that investment in COVID-19, but many companies are going to come up short relative to those winners. So again, you can take a look at stock prices around H1N1 and other pandemics in the past, and you do see companies going up and having higher valuations. But then once the pandemic dies down, the ones that didn't produce products start to fall behind. They lose some of those gains.
Do you have any thoughts on public gene therapy or other companies taking PPP money? Obviously, this has been kind of a subject of some controversy since the program was launched. Any thoughts about that one way or the other?
Because it's a sensitive topic, the companies aren't volunteering that information. So I don't have much visibility on who's gotten what amount of money, but I'm sure some have tried and some have succeeded.
Yeah, I think it's a very individualistic decision, and if it's something that is truly needed to bridge company payroll during the time, and you feel like it's truly appropriate with when the companies interact with their investors, their legal counsel, that it's not something that I can make a blanket statement about. It's something that I think is very individualized based on the current environment.
Yeah, I agree with Jason. It's really a case by case basis. You've seen news reports of money being returned by certain larger firms, and is that different than a small, 2, 3, 4 person company trying to, work towards a pre-IND meeting? As you mentioned, it's a discussion with legal. It's a discussion if you have a parent company or if you have a sort of a network of companies. To be consistent and have the right message. Again, it's phase of development. It's cash on hand. There's a lot of factors. I just hearing through the networks, there's been a mix of responses on what to do with PPP.
John, is there anything from your experience raising money this year that you feel is particularly apropos to folks thinking about fundraising right now?
Yeah, we were in a situation, if people are familiar, of being acquired at the end of last year. So we had a little bit of a different route to raising money this time than, previously being public and going through traditional market routes. So that's why the question we discussed about previous investors is important. If you do have that, and what have their reactions and sort of their temperatures have been, we were fortunate to have a syndicate that was existing, that is highly, skilled in evaluating these targets, and, really believe in sound science and the programs they're working on. So, as we moved through the first quarter and then eventually into the pandemic, luckily we were already working towards this. And, regardless of it, I think their long-term belief was, that there's a potentially viable commercial product out of this pipeline. So, they continue to invest. And so we had folks come back in who were in the original rounds and then reinvest. And that support is always the, sort of best kind of investor that we can have. And the belief in the management team and the products and, the infrastructure to produce. And I think so, our takeaway was it's really the investors having the belief in the science. And so, if there's new investment to be had, meetings are still happening, calls are occurring. They may move at a slower rate, but it's important to continue those discussions, really sharing where you are. You may even find you're trying to do a number of meetings to do updates with investors or groups or M&A partners, anything, just really to keep a lot of those irons warm and people updated. What are your contingency plans for managing the pandemic through your programs?
Got it. Someone asks here, can you speak through the VC fundraising process for a Series A and beyond in the current COVID environment? I think the question is in part, kind of, is the fundraising process from start to finish significantly different in the COVID environment than it was before?
I wouldn't say it's significantly different. I think there are groups that had previously loved to have more face-to-face contact with management teams and like to do site visits. So you might see a little bit of movement towards people preferring teams that are a little bit of a known quantity, that they've either had experience directly with or are indirectly familiar with them due to reputation and past success. So I could see a little bit of movement towards that. The fundraising process, as far as interacting with firms and building a syndicate, I think is broadly similar, although the level of responsiveness to diligence, I think, might be up a little bit because a lot of people have tightened their filter. So you might need to, it might be a little bit more laborious, unfortunately, on the company's end, getting questions back to investors. And I think people need to adjust timeline expectations a little bit, such that it might take a little bit longer to pull the syndicate together than it previously did, just because people are, in my experience, trying to work with a few syndicates now, is people are going a little bit deeper on the diligence at this time and doing a little bit less drafting on the lead.
Another question about the current environment is whether, if you were a startup company really just getting going and looking for your seed funding, would you wait or go ahead and try to raise that money now if you had the option?
I think if you have the option, you should take the money, especially if it's at terms that aren't particularly onerous. John, as a CEO, how do you think about that?
Yeah, sometimes they say when money's available, right? That's
Yeah.
a pretty common theme. And like you said, if it's not under terrible onerous terms and it's something to get you moving off of the start, I mean, it's highly common to have initial seed investors who take some part of the company or take some sort of equity but it gets you moving. And once you have data, you expand your syndicate, your network. So I think the common theme is, money is green, right? Even in the beginning. So
Yeah, I would just add that if the money will make you and your vehicle move faster, take, because R&D productivity metrics, people would be surprised how much of a correlate speed is to R&D productivity. If you wait and others pass you up, you lose the opportunity. So take it if you'll move faster.
But do you think it'll be harder to raise seed money now? I mean, I think that's really the fundamental question they're asking.
So far, again, per the companies cited earlier, Taysha being a very recent example, that was a 30 million Series A. Obviously, you might not call that seed exactly, but we are seeing some pretty supportive investments in early companies, and especially with company formation as well. So far, it's not closed up. There's still a lot of capital to deploy, as mentioned.
Yeah, agreed. And I think there's potential for, I think, money to be a little bit less free flowing in general. But if you have high quality technology, I don't think the stage of investment is particularly impacted by the current environment.
I think we probably have time for two more questions. So again, let me combine one or a couple, which seems to be about whether the requirements, sort of whether COVID has affected the requirements either to secure a crossover, that's sort of one question, or another participant asks whether there's an alternative for a public company looking to raise additional funds to having a clinical catalyst to go to the market to raise additional funds. So sort of two questions about whether there are different potential requirements in this era than there traditionally are for either a crossover round or a follow-on.
For crossovers, I think it kind of goes back to there were a few phases of this during the initial volatility that was kicked off by the initial wave of kind of shelter in place orders, and I think the dawning that COVID was a serious issue that the United States would be dealing with, a lot of the crossovers that we typically interact with were definitely focusing much more on the public markets than making additional private investments, at least for a couple weeks. I would say now that things have stabilized a little bit, those same funds are definitely looking to come back into making some private investments, making some crossover investments. With I would say one caveat is some of them are looking to invest in slightly larger crossover rounds, such that it could give the company potentially multiple windows to go out versus maybe doing a little bit of a smaller crossover round that would give them, a more defined period of time.
Yeah, again, I won't repeat some of what I said earlier, but I'll just add that, companies should be aware that it's not just your traditional IPO. Companies can go public, for example, through reverse merger. Rocket is an example of a company that has performed exceptionally well post a reverse merger, has gotten research coverage and all the things that you'd expect via traditional IPO, and has done secondary offerings as well. And we've entered the era of biotech SPACs as well, which is similar to a reverse merger, but you're starting with a cash shell. And so blue chip funds are actually driving the emergence of biotech SPACs. So, all of those alternatives aren't right for every company, but companies should understand what's right for them and actually consider which options. And some would argue that if, let's say, the traditional IPO market closes, the reverse merger and biotech SPAC IPO windows will still be open before they close because you're starting with actually a publicly traded vehicle that just needs to merge with a private company as opposed to go through the typical IPO process.
Thank you. So last, let me ask a self-serving question since I have the mic. ARM supports capital formation by traditionally organizing conferences and partnering opportunities and kind of opportunities for folks to get together in person. Now that most meetings have obviously gone virtual, and it looks like probably will remain virtual for some time, are there ways that either of you would like to see or would recommend that ARM facilitate capital formation in this COVID era?
To the degree that you can facilitate, I think, one-on-one meetings with companies in a virtual setting and set up venues whereby you can kind of replicate as best you can some of those one-on-one partnering opportunities. That's something that we're extremely interested in continuing to participate in, and actually have found it to be a little bit more efficient, which is nice, actually.
Yeah, I would say that valuation, everyone wants higher valuation, right? So, I talked about that a little earlier, but it's kind of a viral exercise, and if investors globally can meet US and European biotech companies or even Asian biotech companies, if you use your network to sort of introduce people, I think that'll enhance demand for all the companies. An example is Moderna pre-IPO had this good problem of having over a $5 billion valuation because they went global to find investors. So they had heightened demand, they used their capital well, and they've since done, I think, probably 180% up this year or something like that, because they have an mRNA vaccine that could move quickly for COVID-19. So, US companies need to meet European and Asian investors, Asian companies need to meet Europeans, and so on and so forth. And I think ARM can be pretty instrumental in that. And then you've, I think, educated companies about various financing vehicles, to the extent you can help companies understand that. That's also useful because one size does not fit all.
Well, thank you all very much. I think this has been really a useful conversation, judging by the number of questions we got and folks on the line. So Bola, Jason, John, on behalf of ARM and the whole team, thank you very much for joining us today. And Just as a reminder for folks, as I said earlier, the recording of this webinar will be available on the ARM website shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks everybody for listening. And Jason, Bola, thank you for walking through the questions. And you know, it was a pleasure to do the panel with you both.
Yeah, thanks, Janet, and thanks,
Right.
ARM, for hosting.
Yes.
All right,
Thanks,
everybody
Jason.
stay safe. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.